What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the Dunk on AP podcast. Today, we are talking topics 5.6 and 5.7. We are talking about the government's role in industrialization, and then we're also talking about innovations of the industrial age. So, without further ado, let's go dunk on AP. So, what we're going to do here is we're going to explore a little bit more about maybe the countries or the nations that we haven't explored as much. So, let's start with Egypt, and we're going to start with Muhammad Ali of Egypt. Not that Muhammad Ali, a different Muhammad Ali, but technically this guy might be that Muhammad Ali because he came before that Muhammad Ali, if you get what I'm saying. So, Muhammad Ali of Egypt, he was an Ottoman Albanian ruler of Egypt from 1805 to 1848. He attempted to foster industrialization between 1812 and 1840, and he focused heavily on the textile industry with cotton, linen, wool, and silk. Remember that the Ottomans occupied Egypt at this time. The Mamluks held power from 1517 to 1798, and Napoleon led a campaign to occupy Egypt from 1798 to 1801. Muhammad Ali was sent to Egypt to regain control of the empire for the Ottoman Empire. Now, after the withdrawal of the French in 1801, Muhammad Ali fought against the Mamluks. He became governor of Egypt in 1805 after gaining public support. He eradicated the remaining Mamluks in 1811 to solidify his control of Egypt. Now, the effects of European goods on non-industrialized economies like Egypt. So Europe in general had already industrialized, and that meant cheap exports for like cotton textiles. Egypt has locally produced cotton textiles, but is not using industrial factories. So the cheap imports compete with existing local producers in Egypt. If cotton textiles can be obtained via cheap imports, why continue to locally produce more expensive cotton textiles and spend the time and money to build a factory that would produce cotton textiles? So, economic reforms are going to have to happen in Egypt. Muhammad Ali's goal was to leave the Ottoman Empire and create a hereditary Egyptian dynasty for his sons and grandsons that was not reliant on British and French imports and was free of European control. And this is part of a larger movement. I mean, Egypt is not the only place doing that. You're going to see a lot of nationalist movements like this where it's like, hey, we don't need to be a part of some big, massive empire. What if instead of doing that, we're our own independent, autonomous country? And it's pretty understandable. So this is going to happen. Muhammad Ali's goal is going to be achieved by land reforms that raise land taxes considerably. Land-owning peasants could not pay these new taxes, and all agricultural land was confiscated and became a part of a government monopoly in Egypt. The Egyptian government purchased agricultural export products very cheaply and exported them at much higher prices. Now, through Egyptian industrialization, the military industry was developed. Navy ships, weapons and armaments, and military uniforms were produced in factories. The textile industry was 43% mechanized by the late 1830s. State-led industrialization was initially successful but began to fail in the 1850s. The failure of industry in Egypt was because of a lack of coal for fuel that made operating factories more expensive compared to their European counterparts. Animal labor often subsisted for fossil fuels and was less efficient, obviously, than fossil fuel was. It's not going to move as quickly. It's not going to be as efficient. Tariffs imposed by European powers stifled Egyptian textile production. Remember, when you're playing against an experienced industrial player like Europe, and namely Britain, you're going to have a problem because they're going to be able to impose tariffs on you. They're going to be able to sort of lean their industrial and colonial power on you, and Egypt is going to suffer because of that. Muhammad Ali's policies were reversed or abandoned after his death in 1849, and Egyptian mechanized production ceased by the 1880s, and Egypt was deep in debt to Great Britain. Now, moving from Egypt over to Japan, which we've talked about a good bit at this point. So the Tokugawa shogunate enacted Sakaku policies, remember, in the 1500s, which limited Japanese trade interactions with Western powers. Didn't cut them off completely because they still interacted a little bit with European powers, but not much at all. The Tokugawa shogunate, though, is overthrown in 1868. Now, the Perry expedition, led by U.S. Navy Commodore Matthew Perry, arrived in Japan in 1853. They demanded trading rights and land for coaling stations. They returned in 1854. This resulted in the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854. So the Treaty of Kanagawa, what happens through this is it's going to open two ports to American ships. It's also going to establish a consulate. It's also going to allow for assistance for shipwrecked sailors. It's also going to give most favored nation status. It's also going to lead to the opening of trade and currency exchange, and it was signed by Japan really without much of their choice under the threat of force. And this is going to mark the end of the Sakaku period of isolation. And what's going to happen is that Japan is going to wake up to the world and say, oh my goodness, we are going to be bait for the imperial sharks. We can't have that happen. So they're going to abolish the Tokugawa shogunate in 1868. This is also going to mark a shift from feudal rule to a centralized bureaucratic government, getting with the times there, Japan. It's also going to lead to the adoption of Western technologies. It's going to lead to a ton of economic reforms. It's going to also lead to a massive shift toward Western culture. It's also going to lead to the recognition or the renegotiation of unequal treaties. So you're going to see a big fight between the old way and the new way in Japan, with a sort of a birth of the new old way. They're going to restore the emperor to a lot of power, which was something that they had before the Tokugawa shogunate. They're going to look for that sort of samurai golden age mixed with a lot of the new European style reforms that they're looking for. So in 1868, you get the Charter Oath, which said, knowledge shall be sought from all over the world, and thereby the foundations of imperial rule shall be strengthened. This is going to establish deliberative assemblies, unite all social classes. It's going to abolish outdated customs, embrace international knowledge. It's also going to strengthen imperial rule. So Japan is going to make a massive move toward industrialization in a very short amount of time. Annual silk production is going to go in 1868 from 1,000 tons to 1913, 12,400 tons. Annual coal production is going to go in 1875 from 600,000 tons to in 1913 to 24,500,000 tons. You're going to have a steamship fleet in 1873 of 26 ships, up to 1913 of 1,514 ships. And then a railroad track in 1873, in 1872, you've got 18 miles. In 1914, you're going to have 7,100 miles. And this is all part of the Meiji Restoration. The British locomotive used on the first rail line between Tokyo and Yokohama in 1872 is going to revolutionize the railroad. You have a massive westernization of Japan from 1868 to 1912. And so the causes and effects of these economic strategies of the Meiji era in Japan, the causes are going to be the threat of Western imperialism. Of course, they don't want that, can't have that. The unequal treaties and the forced opening of Japan by Commodore Perry. The desire to foster national unity is also a major cause. You also have the need to improve agricultural productivity and create jobs. Now, the effects of all of this stuff, of these economic strategies of Meiji era Japan, you're going to get the move from feudal agrarian society to industrialized nation. You also have modern infrastructure, including railways and ports and telecommunication systems. Again, all the stuff that's been happening to the European countries, it's just now it's happening in Japan in a very short amount of time. It doesn't hurt that Japan is not that big. You're also going to have military modernization. That's going to be important here soon. You're also going to have the emergence of Japan as a major world power. And Japan is going to shock some folks with how much their trademark Japanese intensity is going to lead to them westernizing and becoming an actual world power. Now, at this time, just sort of shifting into 5.7, you get a lot of economic developments and innovation in the industrial age. So what you're going to get is a movement from mercantilism to more free trade policies. Remember, mercantilism was the dominant economic idea in Europe in the 16th through 18th centuries. This was the idea that there was a finite amount of wealth in the world. Wealth, or capital, is measured in gold and silver in the mercantilist idea. The goals of the goals of mercantilism include exporting more than is imported in order to increase and stockpile your wealth. Colonies serve the mother country by providing raw materials and do not engage in trade outside of the mother country. And remember, this was a big point of contention for the American colonies. They wanted to sort of do their own trade, whereas Britain was saying, no, you can't do that. This also requires heavy government intervention. And now, when I say mercantilism was big from the 16th to 18th century, I want to specify what those time periods are. That's about the 1500s to about the 1700s, even though you will see it bleed over into the 1700s. Now, we're going to shift away from that, away from mercantilism, into more free market economies. This is what's going to emerge in the 1700s, but really grow more in the 1800s. Wealth in free market economies is not finite. All parties can profit or benefit, unlike in mercantilism, which, remember, I always compare to fantasy football, where I want your team to be terrible, I want my team to be good. In free market, it's more like, hey, let's make a deal that works for both of us. Supply and demand, also known as the invisible hand of the markets, drives economic activity. Government intervention is limited or minimal in free market economies. And a lot of times you see this referred to as laissez faire, government hands off. Let business be business rather than government getting their hands all over it. In mercantilism, it serves the state or the nation, whereas in the free market economy, it serves individual producers and consumers. Now, you're going to get new financial instruments in this free market economy. You get limited liability corporations, or LLCs. Investors' risk in a business is reduced only to the amount which they invested, and that encourages more people to invest because, not totally unlike the stock market, I'm going to put in some, but I can't lose more than I invested. You also get formal stock markets building at this time. The need for an efficient way to buy and sell shares of corporations led to the modern stock exchange and becomes an important way to raise capital quickly. Now, the precursor to LLCs are joint stock companies such as the East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, which introduced the ideas of somewhat limited liability in stocks or shares. The investors in the East India Company were only liable for the amount that they invested. The Dutch East India Company was the first to issue stocks for the general public. So, why weren't the chartered joint stock companies from the 17th and 18th centuries LLCs if they had limited liability for their investors? Well, there is a difference. Joint stock companies such as the East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, their government chartered plus their monopoly power. They also have sovereign functions. They're limited liability, and they have a huge scope and scale. Whereas the modern limited liability corporations, they have no grants of monopoly rights to trade in certain regions. They're private instead of government charters. That's a big thing. LLCs are private. They aren't government chartered like joint stock companies. The LLCs also have no sovereign functions. They're limited liability. That's something they have in common, but then they can have large scope or multinational, but cannot govern entire territories. Whereas the British East India Company basically did govern all of India after the Sepoy Rebellion. Now, stock markets. A stock is shares of ownership units in a company. Also, you get shares of stock that pay the owner dividends based on the company's profits. The first stock exchange was set up in Amsterdam to trade shares of the Dutch East India Company, and the Philadelphia Stock Exchange in 1790. Also get the NYSE in the New York Stock Exchange in 1792, and then you get the London Stock Exchange in 1801, the Bombay Stock Exchange in 1875. You also get the Tokyo Stock Exchange in 1878. At this time, from 1750 to 1900, and a lot of it as a result of the industrial age, you get multinational corporations. These are business entities that operate in multiple territories, managing production or delivering services in more than one nation outside of the home country. You get the Rio Tinto Corporation, formed in 1873. This was in Spain. It was named for the color of the water, which contains heavy metals. So, British and Australian investors bought mines in Spain, and the company expanded to include operations. The Rio Tinto Corporation expanded to include corporations in Canada, the U.S., South Africa, and Mongolia. At this time, you also have Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, the HSBC. This was established in Hong Kong as a way to finance trade and commerce within the British Empire, specifically between China and India. You also get the Unilever. This is the first modern multinational corporation established in 1929 through merging of British soap maker Lever Brothers and the Dutch margarine producer company Margarine Unie. So, this is all really, in a way, industrial capitalism, and it looks so modern to us because so many of our modern businesses are like this. And this is part of how the industrial revolution shapes the modern world, is creating these massive businesses like this. Industrial capitalism is an economic system characterized by private or corporate ownership of capital goods, production for profit, and the use of wage labor. The factory system is a key component of industrial capitalism. Now, the effect that is industrial capitalism. What are the effects? The effects of industrial capitalism are the development of industrial capitalism, leading to increased standards of living for some, and to continued improvement in manufacturing methods that increase the availability, affordability, and variety of consumer goods. This increases people's standard of living. It also leads to a wider variety of affordable goods. It's also going to lead to the beginning of modern advertising that is so incredibly, unfortunately, familiar to us. You can't watch a YouTube video without watching like 17 ads before. This is also going to lead to modern consumer culture. It's also going to lead to the cycle of increasing production efficiency through those factories, and advertising feeding that consumer culture, which in turn fuels advancements in production. So you start to see, again, modern ads in the way that we would see them now, not necessarily videos, but in pictures. So this is the way that the government really grew industrialization. And then because of so much of that, you get private businesses that are going to lead to a ton of innovations in the industrial age, like LLCs, limited liability corporations, but then also advertising for businesses that are multinational, beginning to grow all over the world. Let me know if you guys have any questions. I know this was a long one. Have a good one.